Really thrilled and privileged to be introducing Gary Griffin to you. And I've known about Gary's work for a very long time, having been impressed with it as he's obviously a master metalsmith and does fabulous work. But also I got to travel with Gary this year to Mexico, Gary and Pat Griffin, and many people from Seattle, and we had a fantastic time. And so I know you're going to have an incredible workshop with Gary. And if you haven't signed up and there's room, I really recommend it. Personable and wonderful and incredibly talented. Gary Griffin is a practicing metalsmith living and working in El Rito, New Mexico. Griffin was born in Wichita Falls, Texas in 1945 and grew up in Southern California and the Southwest. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from California State University, Long Beach, and his Master of Fine Arts degree from Tyler School of Art, Temple University. So we have 2 Tyler graduates here. He recently retired after 32 years of postgraduate teaching as artist in residence and head of the metalsmithing department at the wonderful Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and previously at the School for American Craftsmen, Rochester Institute of Technology. The recipient of 2 National Endowments for the Arts grants, Griffin has exhibited extensively in the United States, Mexico, South America, Japan, and Europe, and the world, as we know. I'd like to introduce Gary Griffin.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and being one from a desert climate, I can feel my skin being moisturized at this moment. To begin this, what I want to do today is to take you through a number of bodies of work that have existed over a period of time, but it certainly is not all-inclusive, and primarily to deal with recent projects. And hopefully this will exemplify some of the thinking, and the thinking in many ways, and the way the work looks varies. You might wonder at some points, did the same person make all of this? But that has been characteristic where over the years I've been working in metalsmithing, that there have been progressive bodies of work, and it's changed over time in terms of materials, processes, scale, etc. And basically, I'm interested in the field in the biggest, grandest sense that one can imagine, trying to get my arms around as much as I can. And it's very simply curiosity. The first thing I want to talk about is a project that I'm still involved in, and I call it acanthus because it's rooted in the acanthus leaf. We all know it from the Corinthian capitals and this decorative element that exists. And so here's a little bit of the story. This all began when a friend of mine gave me a box of cast iron acanthus leaves, and these are, in fact, 19th century adaptations of architecture. In any event, I looked at them and didn't really think much about it. I thought they were cool, but never really imagined what I might want to do with them. And subsequent to having the box of these, I made a trip to Greece. This is the Temple of Zeus in Athens. And when you're in that environment, you begin to not only see the highest levels of achievement of culture relative to what's called the Corinthian order. But along with that, I realized that the acanthus plant is ubiquitous in the Mediterranean. So in other words, the culture that developed this decorative image looked right on the ground, and there was the leaf. So this is an acanthus, and believe me, these things get big. They're 7 feet high. They're everywhere. And the leaf, of course, is seen here, and here again, this is a 4-foot width, by the way. These things are huge. This is in the Roman Agora in Athens, and a detail of that with the acanthus. And here on columns. Now this decorative sensibility spread throughout the ancient world. It became the arabesque in the Middle East, and it went to England in the 19th century and became wallpaper. So I love this idea that this decorative symbol, which we're not sure what it actually means, which I like that idea. In other words, in this time of information, knowledge, believe me, we've all been well-schooled, we've read these things, but we really don't know what this means, and we suspect it has something to do with revival, life after death, something that would be typical naturalism and growth. And this one I especially like because not only do you have this, this capital and you have the acanthus, but then you have another capital and column buried within it. So there's this kind of depth within it. And also there's a kind of perspective in this piece. So this one is, to me, is even thicker in the sense that it's thicker as an image. It has more depth to it, not only visually, but depth intellectually. Anyway, when I get into something, I read a lot and try and discover, the roots of this kind of ornament. But also along with it, I'm looking for some kind of inspiration in terms of art. And at this point in time, in terms of my own work, there were a couple things happening. One was I became very interested in shape as opposed to form. Now, if John Marshall were here, he'd probably have a heart attack because he's a form person and he loves that dimension. And it's a very important and powerful aspect to metalworking. For whatever reason, the idea of flatness and the idea of shape became really, really important. So in that regard, I was very interested in work like Frank Stella and those assembly things that he did with flat shapes and how I could pile up flat things to create dimension, but they were still shapes. The other part of that was I didn't really know what I was going to make. In other words, this was just exploration. There was no project. It was curiosity. And so one looks at this thing and you think, well, what am I going to do with this? And with this idea of shape and then the idea of sectioning something, I did something really simple. And I sawed it in half. And I got a shape. What interests me about this is that you end up with this very abstract shape, and yet it's directly related to the floral. In other words, it goes back through the 19th century to the acanthus leaf. It goes back to the Corinthian order, and it eventually goes back to the acanthus plant. And I love that idea, that it's in the line, that it's connected. And it's not unlike if I were to present you with a Polaroid picture of anyone in the audience, and we would see that image, and then simultaneously I would show the chart of one's DNA. It's the same individual, but they're encoded differently. One is a photograph of the individual, and the other one is this encoded kind of message. And I think that this is somewhat like that notion of encoding. So the next step was more sawing, of course, and then how to take that and somehow just draw or compose with it. So what I did was I got a rubber stamp pad, started stamping the images and putting them on paper. So this is like a lexicon of these shapes from different sections. And following that, I started making drawings with them. Just, composing with the idea of value shifts in it. And oddly enough, they happen to be horizontal or vertical rectangles which look like gates. But I never knew exactly how I would make it if it ever became a gate. Along the way, I was having a conversation with a person that was a client and mentioned, they asked, they always ask you, what are you doing these days? And I said, well, I've got this thing I'm really curious about. I told the story much like I'm talking right now. And they said, well, we're going to do a project? Let's do a project. And I said, great, but you have to give me as much time as I want, and we'll just follow it along and see if it really amounts to anything. Anyway, the drawings progressed. and eventually ended up with this one, and this became the beginnings of a gate project. Now, since they were shapes, it allowed me to approach the idea of cutting these things out, and of course, these days, the laser is the way to go. And scan them, digitize them, got them into the computer, and first cut everything out in cardboard. Now, one of the things that I love about this is that if you look at these full-size cardboard cutouts, that if you put them in this position, it seems to me you have something that's like a figure. But if you put them in this position, you have something that's like a landscape or an EKG or something of that nature. And it's the same thing as when we're on our computer, you get two options for printing, right? Portrait, landscape. That's what this is, portrait or landscape. And it's as simple as that. So I made 3 different patterns, and they all have a very similar characteristic, evidence from the sections of the acanthus leaf. One of the things that happened as a result was because of having these full-size cardboard pieces, I could actually sketch this up quickly on a wall and draw out the frame of the project and then begin to simply compose. And at this point, I think it's a little bit like shooting from the hip. You know, you get in there and you start working with this stuff, and we all do this. We've been there, and we're relying upon all those things that for the years of experience, we're deeply embedded in our bone marrow, and we just do it. You know what I mean? Just putting it up there. And so, you know, this is the way the composition evolved. Now, one thing I want to point out, in addition to this kind of shooting from the hip idea, where it's very intuitive, there's also the moment where you stand back from the thing and you say, well, what am I really doing? And that's when a more critical or intellectual side of your brain gets to work. And it disturbed me that the centers of these were the same weight as the frame. And so I want you to just look at this sequence to see the middle of this frame disappear. So here it is, full size. And what that little move did by thinning this middle area is it allows this pair of doors to kind of parenthetically bracket the subject matter, which are the leaves. And from my point of view, this was a good idea. So that's what I went with. The other thing that was very new for me, but that the digital process made possible, is I could build the full-size project at the same time I built the model. So here you have the model with all the little pieces, and then you have their cousins or friends over here that are precisely the same pieces. And in this way, it allowed me to compose this and make adjustments. So here's the full-size pieces being assembled simultaneously with the model. And I think it's for me, it was the first time I did this, and it was an unusual way to work because characteristically, I would always make the model first and then make some changes, of course, in the final project. But this was new, and it was really, really useful. I want to point something out here that is a design device, a sensibility. There's nothing new about it. It's existed for hundreds of years and is compared to, in the Gothic period, you might be in front of a Gothic cathedral. There will be rosettes all over the doors. And you initially see it as being symmetrical. All the rosettes appear to be the same. They have a good balance to them. And then as you get closer to it, it becomes apparent that each one of those is different. That somehow a craftsman has gone in there and put in a gargoyle or a dragon, or one of the leaves is different, whatever it is. And it's one of those ways in larger work where you can have what appears to be true from one distance, and then that changes as you get closer and you inspect it. So something very simple, but if you look at this element and this element, they're the same element in the same place, but they've been reversed. So in other words, that there's the apparent symmetry of this project, but then by flipping these elements and also moving them within the picture plane between front and back, that it changes the piece in terms of a kind of asymmetry. And I like that idea very much. I like it because you build depth into your project. And it's not something that one discovers immediately. It's something that reveals itself over a period of time. And I think that the very best projects are ones that we revisit and then we continue to learn from them. That's the goal. Here's the project evolving. And then this is one of the models, which is the piece that was actually built. And then alongside that, I had extra pieces, so I did another one that was more open and is evidence of exactly the same process and pieces. Now, about these models, they allow a number of things. First of all, they represent you, and Harriet did a marvelous job of talking about artists representing themselves. And one of the hardest things to do is to project your ideas into the world, and especially if you build projects you can't carry along with you to show somebody. The models are so useful because they communicate a number of things. Number one is that in scale, they communicate the materials, the processes, and the idea of the way something looks. But in addition to that, depending upon how you make the models, and I go to great ends to make the models really precisely, it communicates the quality of the work that the client will receive when they get the real project. So these things are true representations. They're great tools, and they're a way to project yourself into the world. And in addition to that, it's much easier to send this to an exhibition than it is, a 300-pound gate. This goes in a box. This is the envy I have for jewelers. You put the thing in a box, put it in the mail. I'm in there with staple guns and plywood, etc. But anyway, the models are very, very useful, and they're a great way to communicate. And I own all the models, and I don't charge the clients for them because I want to keep them in my studio to show other clients. They're very, very useful as communication tools.
What's the size of that?
It's about this big. And I can't remember the scale, but it's all written on the bottom of them. Oh, just a detail. I want to, now I'll go into projects that I've made, things that have been built, and try to divide this into a number of sections. So these are all gates and gardens. And this is an early project from the late 80s. It's a hollyhock doors. You can see the roots at the bottom. There's trellised roses on the sides. And then there are these grass section panels that exist beside this. This project ended up being 100 feet long, so there were 10 of these panels and there was another set of gates. But some of the things I want to point out, part of the idea was that you would have this comparison of a kind of formal order of brick along with this more rusticated sensibility of stone. You'd also have, again, in this free-flowing kind of field of grasses, with trellis kinds of things. So there's this play between the formal and the more organized and the more rusticated and naturalized. The other thing that projects like this accomplish is that during the spring and summer and fall months, they recede into the garden. So in other words, all the foliage is coming out, the trees, the roses are blooming, the iris are up, etc. And the project tends to recede. But during the winter, the project is the garden. And so it has multiple lives based upon seasons.
Where is that?
This project's in Southfield, Michigan, and you won't believe this, but when we first installed it, okay, it's in the ground, everything's set, and then 2 years later, the couple decided to move. And they said, we want you to come over here, deinstall it, we're going to store it for a year, and then we're going to put it in our new house, which they did, and we added to it, added the length. But it was, just one of those things that one never imagines is going to happen. Another project, this perspective gate, and of course these gates have been made before too. This idea of perspective is not new to ironworking. There are some marvelous cathedrals, 19th century, 18th century, where this is used as a barrier between the congregation and the clergy in terms of the old order, let's say. And the thing that the model was so important because what I realized after I did the drawing, then I realized perspective was not invented to see the other side. Like, what does the other side look like? I mean, this is the front. You can build this, but how would you actually build it? And so the model became really important to discover how I would build this thing that I had not a clue what the other side would look like. Usually, anything we're making, we have a pretty good idea that there's going to be a pin back on one side. We know where we're going, but seriously, I just didn't know, and the model was very, very revealing in that regard. So here's the installed project. It's about, I'd say about 9 feet high. Not a really large project, but just imagine you're going from that scale, and then these chrysanthemums are about 1 inch in diameter. So there's still that leftover jewelry scale sensibility alive and well. And this more opaque panel represents the ground. And by the way, the placement of this project actually lets you know where you're going. So in other words, in little simple ways, this opening within this path is scaled to this opening. So there's a kind of deja vu thing that's going on here. When you walk up to it, you suddenly realize that you're in real time and space, and then you're in this other time and space of the perspective of the project. Another project with hollyhocks, and very often with these things, the problems that one may be solving are relatively simple, but they are the things that make them challenging in my mind. And in this case, the frame is very, very thick, about 3 inches thick, and it looks like a picture frame. So I was hoping to project the idea that these were somehow picture-esque, but at the same time, these hollyhock flowers are beginning to move outside and colonize that frame, something like a runaway garden of sorts. These projects are all forged, by the way, forged and fabricated. And so when you compare that to the laser cut acanthus project, really different strategies technically. And I frankly have a lot of trouble separating out the technical aspects from the aesthetic aspects from the idea, concept, whatever you want to call them, because they all just kind of come together. And this will be even more clearly illustrated when I get to the Kohler work, which is the last part of the talk. This is the largest project, and these are the entrance gates to the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Cranbrook has a marvelous selection of historic gates. There's Sam Yellen, Gothic Revival. There's Oscar Bach, the great Art Deco master. There's Edgar Brandt, and then the Saarinen gates, which are in front of the museum, which are a kind of abstracted modernism. And part of the charge here was somehow to acknowledge part of this history. and at the same time do something that would add to it, which I think is, I think it's probably all of our goals. You know, we become aware of these histories, and then we say, well, okay, what could I make that would somehow challenge me and then also contribute to the weight of the history? And there's a couple things going on here that were important. What you have to imagine is in this vehicular gate that there's actually a perspective that exists behind this. So the road rises in elevation about 300 yards down the road. There are trees that were planted specifically with a gap in them. In other words, planned these things, Saarinen planned them. He knew very well what he was doing, and he was giving us a line of sight. And I thought, well, this would be a good idea to pick up on that. And if you look carefully, you'll see that all these curved lines end at a kind of vanishing point in that middle, which is where those trees begin. At the same time, it has a kind of briar patch sensibility in here that begins to loosen up towards the middle. And there's two things that I hope happens there. One is that the briar patch is inherently kind of organic, going back to things such as flowers, leaves, etc. But at the same time, it is very abstracted, and this idea that the center is more open. So for example, if you were going to walk into a cornfield, you would not walk over the corn stalks. You would walk in between them. There's an inherent language that exists there that we know that the center of the gate is in here, and that's probably the area we're going to walk through. But it's also reinforced with this idea of this more open framework. And then in the pedestrian gates, another historical idea is this notion of the gate within the gate, similar to the columns that I showed you with the acanthus, or the idea of the keyhole. Those are all part of the sign systems. And of course, Harriet's, you know, the master of that with her encoded Viagra lines and tin cans, etc. And then here's the project installed. One of the things that became really important, the model was built symmetrically. In other words, even though these sides are not the same length, when I was making the model, I basically bent up the brass so that it's essentially symmetrical, but that's not the way it was built. And if you look at, well, here's some details of it. When you look at, I'll get to it. If you look at this piece, that here again is this idea of the apparent symmetry. But if you carefully look at each element, and if you follow this element down, and then you look at its counterpart over here, you see that it's not symmetrical. And therefore, every negative shape in here, all of these shapes, the negative space, every one of them is different. And that was very, very carefully composed and built into the project. Another thing is that this glyph originated in rubbings of car tires, treads. And so there's all these things coming into one's studio and into their idea, and then you move with it, adjust it. But I knew that I wanted it to be abstract. It made no sense to go back to the more representational subjects that I've showed you before this. In other words, moving ahead. And there's no question, because this project preceded the acanthus, that I became engrossed within those negative spaces. And those became as important, if not more important to me during the process than the positive part. This is a model. This project was never built, almost, but never built. And it's made in bronze. It's a driveway gate. And you'd have to imagine this rock as being about 5 feet high, and that the pivot is in the center of the rock, so the gate would swing open with mechanical assist. and it's simply entitled Rock with Corkscrew Hazel Branch. So you have to imagine that this is about 14 feet for the opening for a driveway. And these rocks that I make are fabricated. They're sheet metal, welded together, hammered, ground, adjusted, in whatever way where they have the appearance of a rock, but they're very lightweight. And then another set of doors, again, a proposal of this kind of rock door idea, very inspired by a set of doors that Edgar Brandt did for a war memorial. He didn't use rocks, but it has the kind of weight of his projects. This is the opposite side. Here's another garden, very different. This is about 1995. The Detroit Institute of Arts had an invitational where 50 artists were invited to come to the museum. I think this is an idea that all museums ought to do this more often because it's so great for the community. We were invited to come to the museum and submit proposals where we would basically respond to or reinterpret one of the great works in the museum. And so there were artists that were in the Islamic section, there were artists in the African section. You know, every place in the museum was colonized by contemporary artists. Great show. In any event, I was very familiar with the Rivera Murals, and they are just, you know, they're a pilgrimage. If you get anywhere near Detroit, you have to go. I mean, it's an art pilgrimage. You go there and you just marinate in that room because it's spectacular. Anyway, the murals were commissioned by Edsel Ford, who was Henry Ford's son. He was a great philanthropist, a great designer, and a very progressive individual, somewhat different than his father. And they commissioned Diego Rivera to come and paint Detroit industry on the walls, which he did. At the top of these murals, which is kind of a typical theme during that period of time, this is in the late 20s, and also in earlier, to use the races to signify certain things. In this case, the four races are reaching into the earth and extracting the essential elements that it takes to make iron. So the black race is pulling out the coal, the red race is pulling out the hematite, the iron ore, the yellow race, the white race, et cetera, bringing silicone into this mix. And in Rivera's period of time and in Henry Ford's period of time, the source of steel was essentially the earth, mining. The other part that's important about this, originally when this museum was built, this was called the Garden Court, and it was full of plants. So it always was the garden. Anyway, I looked at the murals and concluded that, number one, it was still the garden, and that could be the subject. So the title of this piece is The Garden. Rivera's garden was the earth itself, bringing the ore out of the ground. But in fact, at that time, and even more so today, most of the steel in the world has already been in the world. So in other words, every piece of rebar or angle iron that any of us purchase is probably 60% recycled material. And I had the good fortune to know somebody that was in the scrap business. And the scrap yards in Detroit, believe me, are staggering in terms of their size. And they have machines where they just take a car, and they have a machine that looks like a Cuisinart, except it is enormous. And they just dump the car in, and then it spits all the rubber over here, the glass over here, the steel over here. And they grind it up into, it's like making cookies or something. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, the material that comes out of that are called frags, because the machine is called a fragmenter, and the garden bed that I made are the frags. The other thing is, if you look at these conveyors that are around the edge, which are in a way the fence for the garden, in Rivera's mural, in an interesting way, he uses conveyor chains to actually separate subject matter. So he'll have the foundry over here, or he'll have a production line over here. And the frame for it are these conveyor lines that go through. And what was really cool is conveyor lines haven't changed since Rivera's time. So I found the exact same things that he painted, and they're in this garden as the fence, all along in here. And the other thing is on the corner of this are fractured motors, which are V8 motors, and of course Henry Ford was famous for the V8. Anyway, that's another garden project to compare with the garden fence. The subject's still the same, just different way of looking at it. Here's another thing that was interesting to me, and is another way to think about composing things or making projects. This is a candlestick, and basically you have this twist and this kind of capital element. And the twist is one of the most standard things in ironwork. I mean, everybody makes a twist. And if you are going to even work at the forge, you're going to make a twist. Believe me, you'll make a twist. And so the whole thing is, well, what are you going to do, and how are you going to do something that will interest you, and maybe do something that you haven't seen before. So here's the capital of this post. And I just want to show you how this works, because it ties in to this notion of the section. It kind of shows you how the shape thing begins to work with form. And so here's a bar of channel iron, and it's going to be twisted. All right, so you end up with this long twist, and here again, going to the bandsaw and cutting through it, then reveals these. So you have the twisted piece of material, and then you have these sections that look something like a flame, or it could be a lot of things. But it's in some ways hard to imagine that these two are essentially the same thing. They're just encoded differently. And through assembly, this is what you get. I did a number of these, and in some of them I made a cube out of these small pieces and then ground them on the side. So all the sides revealed these shapes, and then I took those and inked them and printed them. There's always drawings associated with it, with the stamping, or some way to delve into the subject matter in some other way. And here's the code. That was the shape, and then it's used in stamping around it. Tables. This is a small project where someone wanted something that looked like the Michigan woods. So it's very rusticated, and was an attempt to indoor projects don't have to be painted. They can withstand the environment. And so I think there's some things that are kind of interesting going on here in terms of the finishing. In this rock, this is a kind of black and steel, but the acorn has got an iron oxide on it, so it's redder in color. The branches were tinned first, and then scratched back through or sandblasted, and it has a kind of feeling like a birch tree. It's got that whiteness with the darkness adjacent to it. So the biggest, for me, the challenge in the project was the actual finish of it and how it could reveal what the client was interested in. I do make sketches of things. This is an ash branch, and they're objects in and of themselves, but I like to have them around the studio. And this is, it began, interestingly enough, with the interest of a client. I made a big table for a family, and they made flower arrangements. And they liked having flower arrangements. And in the middle of the project, I was invited back to the home, and they said, is there any way you could go to the garden and make things out of things that are in our garden, and we're going to use those in our flower arrangements? And that's how it actually got started. So I made corkscrew hazel branch, ash branches, all kinds of floral elements, and they use these in flower arrangements, and then when they're not arranged on the top of the table because it's got a big glass top, they put them under the table. I mean, there are people that actually live like this. It's fantastic. You know, it's so cool if you can run into people that have these kind of inventive and imaginative lives that love having these things. This is typical of the kind of cattail table. In this one, a kind of recombinant idea. So in other words, this very simple frame can be used in many ways. In other words, it can be reversed, it can be put against the wall as a sideboard. It has a longer life because it's not structured in one particular way. Wheat fields in a coffee table. The wheat heads are cast in bronze, and I would vary the alloy so the bronze color actually changed. There's a redder bronze, and then there's a whiter bronze, based upon additions of copper or whatever I was alloying at that period of time. And then here's something that's completely stationary. This is a large dining table. The glass top that goes on this is 5'6" by 10'6". So it's a large dining table, and it's surrounded, believe it or not, by 19th century Dutch Queen Anne chairs. So it's pretty crazy. And basically, this is a pile of rocks supporting this large frame with a kind of crystalline cambrial leg. And then in the pile of rocks is a book. And the book, the chemical symbol is the symbol for hematite, which of course is the source of iron. The legs. And I'm going to speed this up because I noticed that I'm running on the time. And please forgive me for that, because I'd like to get to the Kohler things, and I know you want to talk about that. So I'm just going to show these fire tools and not talk too much. A fire screen with dogwoods, seasonal, the winter being in the middle. Again, that idea of more open space. All forged, hammered, the fire tool set. More rusticated sensibility, axe, matches. Grapes, and now Kohler. This is a fabulous experience. I would recommend it to anybody. It's exceptionally hard work, it's dirty, it's nasty, and it's so inspiring and fabulous. This is the iron being poured at Kohler. This is the iron. It's like milk. It's that hot and that fluid, and it's unbelievable. This iron is at 2,500 degrees. This is one of the Kohler workers, Whitey, and as you spend time in the factory, you begin to learn who are the people that can pour your molds with more authority than others. Some are shy with the artist's molds, and Whitey was great. And in fact, and then there was another guy named Carl, and these guys can focus so much that one day Carl was pouring one of my molds and his pants caught on fire. And he never lost track of the pour, and he was doing this, trying to put this fire out, but he never lost his concentration. I mean, they are amazing. So I can stand on the side and look really important, but that's not important. This guy's he's doing it all. Anyway, I'm having a show currently at the Metal Museum in Memphis. It's a solo show. This is one of the pieces done at Kohler, and I did 4 bodies of work while I was there. I was there for 4 months, over 200 castings. There was a lot of weight coming home to New Mexico. This is a piece that includes elements from the periodic table that are all metals, and they're metals that I've worked with. And it's installed on the floor. The actual metal portion is 4 feet by 7 feet. So each of these tiles is 12 inches square. And let me give you a little history of the development of this. This is what the surface looks like. You'll notice this kind of mined or terraced sensibility that's around the element. So imagine that these were made in a way that they were cut down into the material, and then what was left was this kind of butte that was the mineral itself. These projects, I really lucked out because Kohler let me get into their machine shop, which is pretty rare. I didn't do the work. The work that I did was all in AutoCAD, and I did all the preliminary work that I then took over to the machine shop, where it was put in their Pro E software and eventually into the CAM program. But the cool thing about it was that these guys would run these things during their shifts. So in other words, they would set this machine up, put the red board, this is the pattern board, and they would put the red board in the machine and then turn the machine loose. So while I'm over there doing something else, this stuff is being machined. And I want to draw particular attention to, this is the edge of one of the letters, and the surface, this is the surface of it. And there were very, very strict choices made regarding the size of the cutter and also the offset of the cutter. And this idea of combing this landscape. In other words, it's a lot like a disc in terms of agriculture going over the land, or it's not unlike mining itself. And so this piece, I think, reminds us of a couple things. One is that these materials we use are in fact the ground. They are the earth. They are the planet. And so the finish on this has a kind of organic sensibility to it, a kind of dry, fairly a value shifting in it with these elements being placed on the floor to somehow remind us that it is the ground. And at the same time, these are things that are so very necessary for our culture to exist. And also, as a metal worker, I can't be one without these. In other words, if these didn't exist, I'd have to have a different profession. These are other pieces, and they're divided into what I call the fractures and the flows. And so what you have to imagine is a picture frame, and that in pouring this picture frame, in terms of how the mold is made and subtle adjustments in it, that I can influence, not control, influence the picture plane. So as the metal is poured, it goes around the frame, and then it literally colonizes the picture frame. It's flowing in there. It is just like drawing. It's comparable to drawing. It's comparable to mark making. And so what I want to show you first are the fracture pieces. This is the show installation at the Metal Museum. And you'll notice that here again, shape plays a large role in this. But in the process, and here's where you just can't separate what you're thinking and the material itself and the conditions at hand. But this picture plane is so thin that the metal actually changes in condition. In other words, the outside frame of this is ductile iron, which is tough. You could drive your car over it. You can hit it with a sledgehammer. But as the metal comes into the picture plane, it gets very brittle. And it made sense to simply take advantage of that brittleness. And so I hit them, every one of them, with a sledgehammer. And then as they began to fracture, go back in and do some composition in terms of breaking something a little bit more or leaving them the way it occurred. There's a lot of chance in this. It's not under control, let's say. But just look at some of these lines and a kind of, I think of them as not being something that I could compose. I just wouldn't be able to think that way, to put that line precisely in that place. I'll just take it. So let me just run through these. Now these are the flow pieces, very different, but the same strategy. In this case, the frames are larger, but the metal never completed the picture plane. And what is going on in here is influenced by the way the gating, but never composed in that sense. So they are very much about chance. But when I look at these, that even though I know what's going on technically, when I first saw them come out of the mold, and remember, I didn't know what was going to happen, but when I saw them, I thought I was looking at a landscape. I thought I was looking at a satellite photo. I thought they might be the Great Lakes. I thought that these edges might be shorelines. I thought that they might be infrared photography in USGS maps. They are, in a way, more comparable to photographs. They're more comparable to topo maps or cartography or things like that. And at the same time, the surface of them is very organic. It is arid. And that's simply because they were waxed and completed and finished in an arid climate. So it's really the first time that I realized that where you live can affect not only conceptually in your head, but physically in the materials, the finish on a piece of work. And I love that idea that it could be locked into some form of regionalism. Physically, not intellectually, that we'd say, wow, we made it in New Mexico. But physically, they look different because they were made in a very arid climate. Some of them are kind of spooky. But look at this line, or some of these. These remind me of Richard Diebenkorn's drawings. I mean, it just, I could never draw that way, but with good luck and a little bit of influence, these occurred. All of this is part of the metal cooling. These could be read by a scientist as well as an artist, or maybe an artist-scientist. And then look at all these little, this is actually Seattle. You see right there? This is what you have to do to get through town. But these surfaces, anyway, I found them very inspiring. This is the last slide. This was the entrance to the show. I would highly recommend the Kohler experience. The Metal Museum is a great place to stop if you're driving across the country. It's kind of a home for anybody that wants to see it, and they show any work that has to do with metal. Thank you so much. I may be out of time, and oh, great. I would be more than happy to take any questions about anything in terms of the slides. No TV questions. Not as bold as Harriet.
You mentioned that a little bit about how communities in New Mexico changed your work. Can you just speak a bit more about that?
Sure. Specifically, what I was talking about was the finishing on the work. In other words, as you well know, the climate is dry. Oh, I'm sorry. I was supposed to repeat the question. The question was, could I speak a little bit more about living in New Mexico relative to the change in the work? And what I was specifically talking about was the climate itself and the arid qualities. And so let me give you an example. After these pieces are rusted, you have, because it's so arid, that when you add moisture to it, it goes, it leaves the project very quickly. And so you move at this slower pace through the patina process. The other thing is that once I stopped that process, when I began to wax it, depending upon the waxes that were used, some of these waxes are not only absorbed quickly into that surface, but they're also evaporating simultaneously. And that doesn't happen in Michigan, and I suspect it doesn't happen in Seattle. In other words, that evaporation actually played a role in it, and therefore the quality of the surfaces, which you can't really detect from the slides, but they have a very arid feeling to them. They don't have shine to the wax. They're muted. They're absorbed into the porosity of the rust. And I think it's directly related to the climate. So in that way, I like that idea that it's something that I didn't really choose. Where I live chose that.
Has it changed your work in other ways?
I don't know yet, because when I went to Kohler, before I went, I talked to a lot of people, Maria Phillips, Haas Haley, Tom Joyce, people that had been there before, and I wanted to plan it carefully so that I could make as much work as I possibly could. And so along with the goal of making a lot of work, the other goal was I wouldn't finish anything while I was there, because I thought I could finish everything at home. And that's why I have over 200 castings. So I'm still working off my inventory in terms of those castings. And I don't really know how it's going to change the work. But I did 4 bodies of work while I was there. I did a whole series of prints that were done with forklifts driving over paper, because the ground in the factory is covered with graphite from the casting. So they were drawings. So I've got 60 or 70 drawings to work on. There's a tub that Kohler makes that's a rimmed tub, like a sink that you drop in. And after months of walking past these things and just thinking, I can't deal with all these bathtubs, I happened to look at one day and I thought, if I saw that thing in half, I've got a Corbusier chair. And I mean, just as simple as that, one of those epiphanies, that it took 3 months of walking by to figure that out. And so I did saw them in half. And then I thought, well, why not? We'll enamel them. So I've got these half of tubs that literally do look like one of the Corbusier stuffed chairs. And I'm going to take those and set them into a block of adobe. And, they're great colors. And anyway, so I've got to finish those too. Yes?
So did Carl and Whitey and the other guys that were pouring for you see your show? And if so, what did they think?
They did not see the show. And what I should do is send up image of those. But it's really interesting because all of the workers at Kohler are curious about what you're doing. And they've seen enough artists go through that they're curious about it. Now, not everyone in the factory is, but they really do go out of their way to help you. And I think that there's a kind of camaraderie that exists there. And I don't think that well, for example, when I was doing the forklift prints, one of the guys that was helping me with that was driving this huge forklift that carries 3,500 pounds of molten iron. I mean, this thing is big. And you imagine that the tires are all burned, so it has a fabulous characteristic to it when you print it, and it has a landscape feel within this tread. And after he drove over the paper, and of course he's thinking, this guy's a wacko. And I showed it to him, and he said, well, you ought to give me that because they should give me some new tires. But I do have to tell you another part of it that was really great, because initially when you ask a forklift driver to drive over a piece of paper, they know that there's something wrong. And anyway, you know, the more I did it, people became accustomed to it. And there were two other forklift drivers, and one was a woman that was on the second shift. I think her name was Donna. And anyway, we did a lot of these prints. And then one day, it was a Friday, I believe, I said, Donna, when's your next shift and when are you coming on, because I want to make some more prints? And she said, oh, it'll be Monday afternoon or whatever. On Monday, I saw her driving around, and I was very, very busy, and it wasn't until very late in the shift that I came over with my paper for her to drive over. And she said, oh, I'm so glad you're here, because I told my husband I was going to make prints today. You know, I mean, it's like that's part of the human and inspiring part of it. And actually, I think that we both enjoyed the experience, you know. And, you know, we're from different parts of the country and different people and everything else, but this art allowed us